Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Nun Tet. This week's learning is sponsored by Lisheva Gray. We learned the daf, but we also learned so much more thanks to the wisdom of Rabbanit Michelle and to the wonderful community that has built up around our daily daf. Toda Rabbi. Today's daf is sponsored by Leah Brit in loving memory of her great niece, Nava Tova Bat Yoshua Yisrael Leib Viliora Charna Cherny, on her second Yurtzeit. In her schutne, we see Shalom in Israel soon. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of what we're up to. A bit of a complicated sugi here, the shishim. I want to just remind you what the shishim law means. If you remember in the Mishna, okay, just to go back to the Mishna for a quick minute, we were talking about an animal that went in intentionally into someone else's property, caused damage. They have to pay what they damaged. How do we assess the damage in a field? Things are not fully grown. So what do we say? We assess it based on, we take this field. What percentage is this of a bigger area, like a beit se'ah, where you could grow a se'ah's worth of stuff? Let's say it's 20%. Then we assess what a se'ah would be within a field of 60 se'ah, because we want to basically say we're going to lower the amount because we have to assess how much really, since it's not yet grown and it's not yet cut, it's just part of a bigger picture of a field. So even if the field wasn't in an area that was 60 times, we still assess at that. So let's say, right, we're going to assess a beit se'ah within a field. If let's say a beit se'ah is missing within a field of 60 se'ah, it would be worth X. And then we're going to do 20% of what X is because that's how much is missing from the beit se'ah. That's the basic formula. Now, even though it didn't say that in the Mishnah, this is what I wanted to show you. The Mishnah says, we evaluate a beit se'ah ba'otas sadeh kama hayta yafa b'kama hi yafa. We assess it based on a beit se'ah, and then we also, what's important to remember is we assess it what it's worth at the time. Okay, wherever it is in its stage of growth, which we're going to see all sorts of different opinions about that today that don't all think that. But right now, the rabbis say we assess what it was before the damage, what it is after the damage, but within a bigger field. And then what we really mean is within a bigger field, within an even bigger field of 60 times the amount. So first within a beit se'ah, then within 60 se'ah. That se'ah where it is within 60 se'ah. So then we had a case with the Reish Galuta, the exilarch. We're going to have two stories today with the Reish Galuta, all of them putting the Reish Galuta in a bit of a negative light. Somebody destroyed someone else's palm tree. They said, there's 3 palm trees there. All 3 are worth 100. Well, we're going to assess then 33.3, to which the guy says, what are you doing? You're doing the Persian law on me. Which we didn't really understand what that meant. Maybe we'll have a bit of a hint, although I think it's just a literary connection in the end of the sugya. But it seems like you're not judging me by Jewish law. Jewish law says it's compared to shishim. I shouldn't have to pay that much. He goes to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman says, in fact, it's shishim. To which Rava says, wait a minute, what are you doing? You're comparing, this was a person who damaged, not an animal. When we were talking about in our Mishnah, it was an animal that damaged, to which Abaye says, where do you get off thinking that there's distinction between person and animal? And that's Abaye's proof from this braita. So we started with a braita, which talked about different stages. First, it said a sapling, and according to that, Rabbi Yossi assesses a sapling has a particular amount. Okay, he quotes the Gozreik Zerop Yerushalayim. That's really not important for our purposes. Then we move to chaziz, which is kind of animal fodder. It's the beginning of growing of a little bit. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, we wait until it grows, the whole field grows. We see how good the produce came out that year or how bad. And then we assess based on that. Okay, so we don't assess it immediately. We wait till later. Whereas the rabbis said exactly what they said in our Mishnah, we don't look to some future point and wait till then. We assess it based on what it is now. Okay, again, what's a field worth with it? What's a field worth without it? And we assess it at its current value. Now moving to our Amud, the top of Amud Daf Nun Tet. Achlas madal. If it was grapes and they started to grow like the teeniest grape that comes out right after the flower falls off. So if it's already grown into a grape, this is a later stage. Rabbi Yoshua Now, this is different from Shiur Shabo. Shiur Shabo says, wait till the end of the season, let's see how they grow. Rabbi Yoshua says, we're going to assess it right now at its value, at the value it is. We don't care what will happen with these grapes down the road. We're going to assess right now, but not at what it is right now, a little teeny grape, but what it would have grown into, its potential. So this is a different opinion. This is saying once it's already somewhat grown, we're going to assess as if it was a big grape ready to sell in the shuk. or, a big cluster of grapes. Obviously, we're not talking about one grape here. Chachamim oblim, and then the Chachamim still go back to what they keep saying. No, well, in Kamma yafa, the Kamma yafa. We assess it based on what these are worth now, what a field would go for. If you sell a field with this stuff already growing in it, but it's not fully grown, right? And now it's removed. Again, we make this assessment. Now, notice the rabbis, okay, and the first, I forgot to mention, this is all an animal causing damage. And Abaye had already quoted a braita of a person causing damage, and there it used the exact same language. Now, neither mentions shishim, okay? But basically what Abaye is going to prove in the end is all the time, the Chachamim say the same thing in all these cases. It goes by what it was a minute before the damage, what it is a minute after the damage, based on where it is in the field, right? And then it doesn't say shishim, but obviously it means shishim because we know the rabbis say shishim. So then we're going to say, just like it says shishim there, it also must have meant shishim when it talked by a person causing damage, and therefore proving there's no difference between a person causing damage and animal causing damage because the rabbis use the exact same language. Okay, but in the context of this, we're going to get into all sorts of other opinions, and then the Gemara is going to go off and analyze those different opinions. This next line is very confusing, and I'm not going to even try to explain it yet too much. The Gemara is going to try to figure out what's going on here. So after we have this machloket with the smadar, now smadar is again there's a little teeny fruit there. And Rabbi Yeshua says we assess it as if it was fully grown. The rabbis say we look at what it is worth now within the bigger field. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Mishum Rabbi Shimon, okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda quotes a different Rabbi Shimon saying, what the rabbis are saying, that we assess it based in the bigger field, is only if it's in an earlier stage. Okay, we're going to talk about 3 stages now. Are the really early stages where it's a stem with a little flower there. But achla pagim obosel. Now, there's going to be 3 stages, and this is where it gets confusing. There's the earlier stage, there's the smadal, and then there's the pagim. Now, the machloket was about the middle stage. But now comes Rabbi Shimon, and he says, well, it's not true, right? I'm sorry. It is only true what the rabbi said, that it's assessed as part of this bigger field in the case where it's before this stage. Okay, in the earlier stage, I'll agree with the rabbis. But in a later stage, now you would think they were going to say, but in the stage of smadar, I agree with Rabbi Yeshua, or something like that. But that's not what they say. Avalachla pagim oboser, but if it's already half ripened, that's already later than smadar. So in the end, it sounds like Rabbi Shimon isn't really relating not to Tanakama and not to Rabbi Yeshua because he's not talking about the same thing. He's saying in the earlier stage before what you're talking about, I agree with the rabbis. In the later stage after what you're talking about, I agree with Rabbi Yeshua. But he doesn't say what he holds by in that middle stage. So something's not so clear about this. And he's relating to what they're saying. So he's saying, I agree with you, but like this, it's very confusing. And the Gemara is going to say exactly what's confusing about it and try to figure out what's going on here. But we'll leave that aside for right now because it's not our purpose right now. Our purpose is very clear right now. We're done with the braita. And Katani Miyat, they say, well, look what it said in the braita. And this I already told you to make it easier while you were learning it to see where we're focusing on. Because there's so much else in this braita. Chachamim omrim ro'inotan kama yafa v'kama yafa v'lo katani b'shishim. And notice they don't say shishim here when it comes to the animal damaging in the second braita. But we know the rabbis hold shishim, and it was the same in our Mishna. The rabbis didn't say shishim, but they all explained that the rabbis mean shishim. So elamait lachlamim are b'shishim. The only way you could see is that when the rabbis say what it was and what it is obviously means in a field of 60 times the amount. Hachanami b'shishim, and therefore in that source we quoted yesterday, which I didn't reread, which was Mavkir Karmosha Chaveros Madal, Ro'inoto Kamai Tayafa Kodem Lechem B'Kamai Yafa Lachar Mikem, which is what the rabbi said about a person who damages, in which Abaye basically rejects Rava's attempt to distinguish between a person damaging and his animal damaging or her animal damaging. In the end, we can't distinguish. It must be that the Reish Galutas people were wrong. Rava had really no good explanation for it. His explanation doesn't stand the test. Okay, now if we're already on this, we're now going to have Abaye, and you might find his comparisons interesting, or anyway, creative comparisons he's going to make in a bunch of sugyot here, from this sugya to other sugyot. So the first thing he says is, Amar Abaye, Rabbi Yossi Aglili v'Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad. Okay, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Yishmael say the same thing. This is a common type thing where the Gemara likes to connect two totally different sugyot, which you might not have thought were connected, and say, really, the logic behind them is the same. And that's what's going to be, okay, in the next three sugyot, really, one's going to not be in this exact format, but it's, again, comparing. Abaye is going to compare some other sugya and the logic of it to our sugya, and he's going to say the exact same language of this guy and this guy all say the same thing in another sugya. So that's going to be our next three sections. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili, if you remember, was on the previous stuff. He's the one who says we wait to see how it grows, and then we assess based on the growth. So if you damage someone 6 months before everything grows, you're going to wait 6 months before you pay that damage because we want to see how it grows, how much it's sold for, and then we can assess how much damage you caused. And again, it could be if it's a terrible year and it grows into nothing, you'll actually have to pay nothing, which is crazy. So now, although it's not so crazy because in the end, you really didn't cause a loss. So it's an interesting shita. And now he says Rabbi Yishmael says the same thing. Now this is going to be strange because we're going to quote a Rabbi Yishmael that we've already dealt with a few times in the chapter, in the Masechet. We definitely did not explain it in the way Abaye is going to explain it. And not only did we not explain it that way, Abaye himself explains the Rabbi Yishmael differently elsewhere. In the end, the commentaries claim that it must be that he held both these things can be found in Rabbi Yishmael, and that's how we're going to have to deal with it. But anyway, you might remember this sugya. I imagine you will. So Rabbi Yishmael Detanya, Meitav Sadeu Meitav Karmo Yishalem. You have to pay from the best of your field when you cause damage. Meitav Sadeu Shel Nizak, Meitav Karmo Shel Nizak. Whose best field? It goes by the best field of the one you damaged, not the person who damaged. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva Omer Lo Ba'katuv Elo L'Gvot L'Nizakim Inaydi V'Kav Chomer L'Hekdesh. You might remember we had a lot of dealing with Rabbi Akiva. You would have expected Rabbi Akiva, the way they understand Rabbi Akiva ultimately is, oh no, it's the Meitav of the mazik, the one who damages, it's their best field. And then, right, we said, why does he use the strange language? And what do we learn from this? Anyway, we're not going to deal with Rabbi Akiva today. But it seems to be this debate. Do we assess it based on the mazik or based on the nizak? If you remember, one explanation we eventually explained of Rabbi Yishmael, and this was the main one that Abaye explains, is that if the best land of the person who is damaged is equal to the worst land of the person who damages, that's really the machloket between them. The Rabbi Yishmael will say, oh, well, since your worst land is equal to the one who you damaged his best land, well, then you can pay based on the best price, because based on his best land, which is your worst land, because it really is comparative to the nizak's one, the one who was damaged. Okay, so, but that's not really going to concern us right now, because that's not what they're going to explain to Rabbi Yishmael right now. Below tema kirav idi bar avin. Now, back then we also had this thing, which is you might have thought it means this, and it definitely doesn't. Okay, which is don't say like Rav Idi bar Avin. The Amar Rav Idi bar Avin kigon she'achla aruga bein arugot. What they said, what they first thought when Rabbi Yishmael said, we assess it based on the damage, the best of the nizak. Then what seems to be the simple way of understanding that? Well, let's say my animal comes into your field and eats something, and we have no idea whether it was good land or bad land. We don't know because it's already gone now. We have no idea. So lo yadinan ikhushavai ishmenavai. We don't know. Was it thin land, not such good land, lean land, or was it healthy land? Da'amar kum shleim shmeina b'meitav di'kahashta. What did Rabbi Idi bar Avin say? In a case like that, that's what Rabbi Yishmael means. We're going to do it based on the best of the nizak. We're going to assume that it was the best. So let's say if your best land would have cost 100 zuz, that amount that was eaten, but if it was bad, not such good land, it would have cost 80. So we're going to make them pay 100. Well, that can't possibly be. Because we don't say that. My time, a very simple reason. What's the reason? If I cause damage to your land and we don't know if it was 80 zuz worth or 100 zuz worth, well, you have to prove it was 100 if you want to get 100. So it can't be that that's what he means, that we just assume I damaged your best land. Can't be. Ella, okay, now where are we? We're trying to get to that what Rabbi Yishmael says, this is what Abaye is telling us, is the same as Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Before I read the next line, let's just remember what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, that we evaluate it based on what it'll eventually be worth. And that's how he explains, and like I said, this is a different interpretation than he says otherwise in the beginning of the chapter, in the Masechet. Meitav sadeu shel nizak u'meitav karmo shel nizak means ela b'meitav delikame. It's the meitav that it will become. Umay niyu keha'ach desalik. He pays the value of the damage based on what it will be worth in the future, meaning we wait to see what happens, and then we evaluate it based on how well the land grows. And that's what it means. It's evaluated on the land of the Nizak, and the best of the land of the Nizak. We wait and see when it grows, and then we see how much damage was really caused. And obviously also you're going to get, you might get to a lower amount, but you might also get to a higher amount, because in the end, you're assessing it based on the value of what it grows into and not the value it is right now. Okay, although you could get into less because it's just not worth anything if the land doesn't grow, if the crops don't grow that year. Okay, so that's basically the first sugya of Abaye, saying, let's compare these two machlokot, they must be the same. And again, because this is different than the way Abaye understood Rabbi Yishmael earlier, some of the commentaries say he actually thinks that both can be found within Rabbi Yishmael. This is one interpretation, that's another, and they work together. They're both true. Amar. Now we're going back to a different line of the braita, and this is the line that I was having trouble explaining to you, and you'll see why in a minute. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Mishum Rabbi Shimon. The rabbis say, Kamma yafa, Kamma yafa, about the smadar, which again is that in between. It's a little grape, but it's not yet partially ripened, and it's not the earlier stage where it didn't even come out yet. This thing that the rabbis say, we assess it based on the bigger field, is if it's that earlier stage. Smadar, from there you would infer what? That when it comes to smadar, if what the rabbis say is only true in the earlier stage, it sounds like if they're already smadar, then they agree with Rabbi Yeshua, right? That we see them as if they're already grown. However, the second part of their line seems to indicate the opposite, seems to imply the opposite. Right? The problem is the continuation says, if you eat it once they're half ripened, once you destroy it, once they're half ripened, only then do we look at them as if they're already fully grown. Hasmadar, but it sounds like at a stage before that, they would agree with the rabbis. So either they agree with the rabbis or they agree with Rabbi Yeshua, which doesn't seem to make much sense. Then what's he adding? Right? He should just say, I hold like the rabbis, or I hold like Rabbi Yeshua. So something here doesn't jive, and the implication from sentence one, part one of the sentence, seems to contradict the implication from part two, because again, they're talking about stage one and stage three, and they're not actually talking about stage two, which is where there's a machloket. So they must agree with one of the opinions. So how do we read this? And again, they might agree with one of the opinions, but we're going to have two problems. Number one, which opinion does he agree with? And number two, once we get which opinion, the question is, why does he then say it as if he doesn't agree with either one of them? Amar Ravina kroch utzne. Put it together like this, okay? When he says take the first part seriously. I'm only going to agree with the rabbis if it's at that earlier stage. Then you assess it based on the whole field. But as soon as it says smadal, pagin, obosel, and then they all three go together. Now, even though they're different stages, right? Even once it's a teeny little grape, and obviously once it's already half ripened, then then I agree with Rabbi Yeshua, which means basically he agrees with Rabbi Yeshua. So now the Gemara is going to say, Hachi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Hainu Rabbi Yeshua. Then they're basically saying the same thing, which doesn't make sense. The braita would mention is if they're three separate opinions, and when number three actually agrees with number one. Or as I said, if you really want to say that he agrees with him, either, right? It could have listed Rabbi Yeshua, the Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon, the following. Or it just would have said he paskins like Rabbi Yeshua. So it doesn't make sense. So they have to come up with a creative explanation. So they say, there's something here that's unwritten that they disagree about. And they pull this somewhere, right? In other words, either they have a tradition about it, but it's really kind of out of a hat because it certainly isn't mentioned there. And that's why they're also going to say there's one difference, la halacha, between them, and we have no idea which one holds like which because you can't find it in the words of what they said. So what's the difference between them? And this is a very interesting thing. Then he says, Lo Masaime, before we explain what kachash gufna means, Lo Masaime means we don't know who says what. Okay, but there is a difference between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, which is why they don't clump them together. The difference is, if I damage your field, I pay you the amount I damaged, right? Now, however we assess that. So in this case, we're going to say, since they're already grapes, we're going to assess them what the grape would have grown into. Okay, without waiting to see how my season went, right? But just right now, what could this grape have been worth, or this cluster of grapes? What would it have been worth? So now they say the following. If my animal ate a cluster of grapes in your field, the grapes nearby are actually now going to grow bigger because they're going to get more nutrients, because my grapes aren't taking away nutrients from your grape, from the other grapes, right? The grapes that my animal ate are no longer going to be taking nutrients from that vine, which means that the grapes nearby are actually going to grow bigger, which means that you're going to actually benefit somewhat from the fact that my animal ate them, which means that when I go pay you for the damage, let's say I ate and it was assessed at 100 zoos, okay, the damage I caused, but the grapes nearby are now going to go for 10 zoos more, let's say. So we're going to deduct that, and I'm only going to pay you 90. That's the machloket. Do we deduct it or do we not deduct it? Okay, that's the machloket between them. Now Abaye says, and again I told you that these three sugiot, Abaye is going to start comparing things. So you might be a little bit horrified by the comparison or by the case he's going to bring, but so beware. I'll warn you, it's a rape case. Abaye is going to say, Masaime. What do you mean we don't know who says what? We have an opinion of Rav Shimon ben Yehuda when it comes to rape, where we see that he holds by this deducting principle, which means if he holds it there, he must hold it here. So now we're going to say, Man Tana dechayish lekachash gufna. I do know who is it. Who's the Tana who holds that we deduct an amount of saved future damages? Now, it's not, in this case, it's not save future. Well, you could look at it as save future damages, because everything that grows when it's next to something else, it gets somewhat damaged and it doesn't grow as well. So this is basically preventing future damages in something else, and therefore it gets deducted. So now get ready for the rape case. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. So it must be Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda de Tanya. And luckily, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda gets argued down by the rabbis, okay, because you're not going to love his opinion. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. Ones eno meshalem et hatzal mipnei shesofa litzde'er tachat ba'ala. It's a very interesting statement. Someone who rapes a virgin, so when it tears her hymen, there's pain associated with that. So what he says is the rapist doesn't have to pay. A rapist has to pay the pain. By the way, this doesn't preclude other pain he caused the woman. Okay, he pays pain. He pays all the five nezek, tzar, ripo, shevet, boshe, right? All the things he causes to the woman. But specifically the pain of tearing the hymen, we deduct that. Why do we deduct that from his payment? Because in the end, she's going to tear her hymen. She would have torn her hymen with her husband, and there would have been pain associated with it. And therefore, that pain we're going to deduct. So here you see, we agree that, right? We see that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is the one who holds that we deduct things, prevention of future damages. This is a damage, right? A pain that would have been caused to her in the future. He did it now. So because of that, it would have happened anyway. So he prevented some future damage. We're going to deduct that from the cost. Now, it's a little strange to talk about it this way. And in fact, the rabbis disagree with him entirely and say, Amrulo, thank God they say this, Eino domet. You cannot compare the experience of a woman who was raped to the experience of a woman who's having this happen to her, tear her hymen with her husband. Okay, there's no way to compare those two things. And therefore, obviously, he's going to have to pay her the tza'al. We do not deduct that from the cost of what the rapist has to pay. So that's the yes, you could say it better, willingly, right? It was willingly rather than, right? That's the literal biratzon rather than develop onus, where it was forced upon her. Okay, and fortunately, this is a topic very much discussed lately in the news about rape. So quite a harsh sugya, hard to understand Rabbi Shimon ben Menasse's opinion. Again, he looks at it a very technical, halachic, let's look at the damage caused and that, but the rabbis shoot him down. It's not even, by the way, you notice sometimes the debates are, he said this, he said that. In this case, it's amrulo. They said to him, you're crazy, no way, no how can you even start comparing these things? So at least we see it's a very strong retort against his opinion. So that was Abaye's basically attempt to say, and he seems to be successful in saying, again, comparing something totally from out of left field and saying it's the same kind of idea here. And he's going to do the same thing in a different sugya, also about women. We have 3 sugyas about women today, which I think are all 3 very interesting sugyot. Again, Daf Yomi, we don't have enough time to go into all of them, but they're very interesting. Rabbi. This is the exact same structure as before. This is the first sugya here of the 3 of Abaye. These rabbis, which we're going to see who these rabbis are in a minute, and Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda all say the same thing. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Hadamaran, that's what we already saw, which we now explain, right, is deducting payments. So now we're going to see other rabbis that deduct, right, amounts of future, this is a little different, it's not future damages, but deducting a future cost that the one who damaged prevented the person from having to incur. So we'll see, you'll kind of think this is funny. I think anyway. So Hane Tanai Mahi. So what are these other Tanaim? Did Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer? Okay, we're talking about, they don't tell you this, but we're talking about a case where a man, again, an unpleasant situation, causes a woman to miscarry. Okay, we've talked about this before. Now, if you cause a woman to miscarry, you're ending up saving them money. Okay, now it's interesting. They don't talk about all the money that a child costs throughout their lifetime. Okay, that would be, I think, quite difficult to calculate. But they do talk about two very practical things that are right up front. One says, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Nikeh Chaya. Take down, Nikeh, take off the amount of the midwife. They now save money on the midwife. They don't have to hire a midwife for the delivery. So you've saved them that money. So someone who damages a woman, we deduct that amount. Ben Azai Omer, Nechim Mizonot. Take off money payments because the woman, when she's pregnant, eats more food. She has to feed also the fetus. She often eats extra, although there are some women who eat less because they just have no room sometimes to put. I remember when I was pregnant, I used to sometimes not be able to eat as much because it was just too hard. And there was like no room in my body. But anyway, often pregnant women do eat more. So she's, right, again, they're not talking about mizonot of what you're going to have to feed this child for the rest of their lives. But they're saying right now during pregnancy, she would have, I assume, by the way, they don't talk about the future because there were stillborns and things like that. Now, a stillborn, right, it was quite common. You would still need a midwife, just the baby might not make it. Okay, so now we're going to, whereas, right, there's all these discussions about not knowing whether the child's actually going to survive or not. But we're talking about things that are going on right now during the pregnancy. Right, if you're going to deduct money for the midwife, obviously you're going to say we should deduct money for the mizonot also. But and this comes up from this week's parasha, this coming week. The husband could say, oh, my wife, she's very good. She doesn't need a midwife at all. She can give birth without a midwife. I wasn't going to spend that money anyway, so don't deduct that from the damages cost to me. Right? That's what the midwives say to Paro. They say the Nashim Ivriyot, they're chayot, they don't need midwives. A lot of them just give birth on their own. So there you have, you can't necessarily claim that's a proper deduction. But anyway, we connected these two opinions because, again, there's an amount that we might deduct from the person who causes damage for prevention of future payment that would have been, or loss, or right, whatever it might be, that they're actually causing you a benefit in some way. Those were the three comparisons of Abaye. Now we're moving on to the Psak Halacha. Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, we're back now to the Reish Galuta, who said we assess it based on the value of the tree, versus Rav Nachman, who says no, we assess it based on shishim, right? This tree in a field of 60 of them. So now Rav Papa, Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, Avid Uvda Kapateta, Rav Nachman b'shishim, right? They said we do like Rav Nachman b'shishim. Again, what would this be worth in a field, and then what would it be worth in a field 60 times the amount? It's Lishana Acharina, a different version of this said, Rav Papa, Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, Shamu Dikla Agav Katina Da'ara. They assess the dekel based on in a bigger plot of land. Okay, there's a bit of a debate whether this actually means the same thing. Is it also b'shishim, even though it doesn't say shishim? Is it different? Is it just the wording they use, but it's really the same thing? Or maybe it doesn't mean shishim. It's tough to understand, although it seems like even both versions really say shishim. And Hilchata Kavatei Rav Papa, Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, b'dikla d'Aramai. Hilchata Kavatei Reish Galuta, b'dikla parsa'a. Remember he said to them, you're judging me like the parsim. So now they say at the end, we rule like Reish Galuta when it comes to a type of tree called the Persian version of the date tree. And we paskin like Rav Papa and Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yoshua, paskin like Rav Nachman in the Aramean tree. Now there's a wide range of opinions what these different trees are and why. I'm not going to go into all the opinions, but you can look up in the commentaries. But I'll give you one, which is that the Persian version is, the Persian dekel tree is worth a lot more, and it's the kind of thing that people sell on its own. Because it's sold on its own, it gets assessed on its own. Whereas an Aramean tree is not worth as much, and it usually gets sold within, nobody would buy one by itself. And that's possibly the difference. But again, as usual, the commentaries didn't really know the reality of what a Persian tree and what an Aramean tree is. So they each come up with theories as to what the difference is between them. Okay, Eliezer Ze'eri. Now we get to another story with the Reish Galuta. Notice he's Ze'eri. Ze'eri means small, okay, which is going to come up. It's going to be a little bit of a literary thing here because later he's going to say, I'm a Gavra Rabba, I'm a great man. Okay, so, sometimes somebody might look small or they might be small, but it doesn't mean they don't have greatness. And this is why the Reish Galutas people didn't think he was a great man. And then he basically says, I am. And then he's going to have to prove it. But we'll get to there in a minute. Well, what did he do that caused the Reish Galutas men to get very upset with him? He wore black shoes and went into the shuk of Nahardeh. Okay, this doesn't sound like a terrible thing, but apparently, okay, and there's a whole debate here because it actually talks about in other sugis, the Jews did wear black shoes, but what seems to be he was doing something that the Gentiles were doing. It's possible the Jews had white straps and he put black straps on black shoes, whereas the Jews have white straps on black shoes. Apparently, this is a big deal. It comes up, by the way, in some other sugyot about the shoes and the Gentiles. We'll get to it in Sanhedrin. It's in the whole thing about Yeharei Val Yavor, about things you have to do. Anyway, we'll get to that. But basically, he did something that the rabbis saw as an action that looked like he was being like Gentiles, and they got very upset with him. So he was found by the exilarchs people. They said, why are you wearing different shoes? I'm doing this as a sign of mourning for Jerusalem, which doesn't sound like a terrible thing. Okay, now, why he was doing something that generally the Gentiles did, and that was his way of mourning, that's a really good question. I don't have a good answer for that, but basically, he was trying to be different, to basically use it. I'm not going to dress like everyone else because I'm sad about the destruction of the temple. And we do all sorts of things. Destruction of the temple, right? We put things on our area in our house, leave something unfinished. We break a glass at a wedding. Okay, that seems like not a terrible thing. They said, who are you to be mitabel on Jerusalem in such a public manner? You're not an important person. You're like making yourself into an important person. Now, here we learn something interesting, which is, and it could be, it's different nowadays, but in those days, it was soon after the destruction. And, mourning Jerusalem, maybe, and especially, by the way, for the Reish Galutas people, where they were trying to be the heads of the Golah and say, like, this is great, the Golah, like, don't spend too much time mourning Jerusalem. And it could be that the mourning of Jerusalem was basically reserved for a few special people. And maybe like at weddings, they also did, but that was a specific time and event, okay? Or in your house. But this is a very public event. Going to the shuk with black shoes to mourn Jerusalem, it's a very public event. We only allow big people to do that, very prominent people to do that, not just anybody. So they said, who are you to make yourself into a prominent person? At you have a chavshua. They put him in jail for this, pretty severe. Amar lahu. By the way, you could also imagine it's political here. You have the Reish Galuta. They said, we're the important people. Who are you to say you're so important? Well, it's going to come back at them. So now he says to them, Gavra Rabba. He says, I'm an important person. You might not know me, but I am. Amrule Minayadina. And they said, how are we going to know? Well, we need a test. We need to figure out. So usually what's the test? Ask me a question and any question I'll answer. But he says something a little more creative. You got to wonder why. And you got to wonder why they opted for option 2. He gives them 2 possibilities. Amarlu, atun bal minai milta. Okay, either you ask me a question and I'll answer it. Ana ibai minai milta, or I'll ask you a question. Now, why that's a way of determining, well, you'll see what happens. So he asked them a question. So Amrule, they say to him, Bai'at, you ask us a question. Amarlu, you see their arrogance, right? It's a lot easier to just ask a question. It's much harder to get asked a random question and answer it correctly. Amarlu, hamadikatz kufra. If you cut the part of a palm tree before it really has any fruits on it yet, what do you pay? Amruleh. So now we see why the sugya is here, because it's all about what we've been talking about. Amruleh, mishalem to make kufra. You pay the value of whatever okay, so you're saying it's budding dates. Thank you. So budding dates, whatever budding dates cost. Okay. But he says, but they're going to become dates. How could you say it's just based on what they are now? They're going to become dates. So they say, okay, fine. We'll pay the value of ripened dates, fully ripened dates. But he didn't take fully ripened dates. shouldn't have to pay that, right? And he basically makes them look like fools. Here you see why he was smart in saying, why don't I ask you a question? And he knew how to get them. So by the way, if you're confused by the sugya, you see that other people were confused by the sugya as well. So now, Amrule, Emalan At. So finally they say to him, okay, so tell us, what's the answer? Amr Lahu, B'shishim. He says, we assess it based on the value of shishim. And that's our whole sugya, right? That you have to evaluate what it would be worth within this field, what, in a Beit Se'ah, and then what the Beit Se'ah is worth in this field of 60, and what you would pay for that minus that, and that's your answer. So now, they still don't know that that's the answer. They never heard this before, I guess. So Amrule, Manamar Kabateh. They say, who says like you? Like, that didn't prove anything, really. Amar Lahu, Hashmu Achayu Beitino Kayam. Well, Shmuel's still alive. His Beitin is still there. Go ask them. Shad Daru Kamei de Shmuel. They send before Shmuel. Amar Lahu Shapir Ka'amalahu B'Shishim B'Shavkuhu. Said he was absolutely right at Shishim, and they let him out of jail. They let him go. Okay, interesting story. Again, you see the power struggles, the politics going on here. You see the Reish Galuta in both these sugyot is basically looked at in a very negative way. You see, they were making bad judgments. Okay, they didn't know what they were doing, and thinking that they were right, but really not understanding the halakha. Okay, next sugya. So now this is actually a little still connected, but we're actually finished with that braita finally. That was all about the braita. Now we're going to go to the end of the Mishna. So the Mishna had said, if you remember our Mishna, right now, okay, who remembers what we're up to? So we had the animal that fell in accidentally, right? Ruth's animal falls into Naomi's field and then gets benefits from either the soft fall or eats a little bit while she's there. Then we have if she went in and then you only pay what you the benefit you got. Then we have the case where Ruth's animal goes in intentionally and eats. And then we have, or damages, tramples. Then she has to pay the amount she damaged. And then we had a whole question, how do you assess the damage? So that's what we've been learning, what this Kamma Yafa v'Kamma Yafa, and in the end we learned it's B'Shishim, and that's how we got it. Then we have Rabbi and then we learned from our sugya that it's not only animals, but humans who damage as well. Okay, not just their animals damage, but also if they themselves damage someone's field. And that's how we got there for the Reish Galuta story. And from there, we got off on this whole long tangent because we quoted that braita. Now we have Rabbi Shimon Omer in the Mishnah, Achla perot gmurim. What if the produce is fully grown, but it's still attached to the ground? He says at that point, Mishaleme perot gmurim. Then you pay the actual price of what they would cost in the shuk. Im se'ah se'ah, im satayim, right? If a kilo costs this, then you would, get that amount. So now we're going to learn about this Rabbi Shimon opinion. The rabbis don't agree, obviously, because the rabbis say no. Right? He disagrees with the rabbis. My time, and what's his reason? Right, which meant we do it based on melamed sheshamin al gava sadeh, that we assess it since it's in the field. We assess it based on the field itself. That's only something that needs the field still. Once they're fully ripened, they don't need the field anymore. Because these don't need the field anymore, they're fully grown, even though they happen to still technically be attached to the ground, but they don't need the field, and therefore they're not assessed based on the field. We only assess based on the field when it still needs the field to grow. But if it doesn't need the ground anymore because it's fully grown, then we base it on that it's just not this whole limud that we had about based on the field. It's not based on field because it's not needing the field anymore. I'm Rav Huna bar Chia amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. Dan Rav ke Rabbi Meir upasak hilchata ke Rabbi Shimon. We're now going to get to our third halacha about women today. We had the rape case, we had the miscarriage case, and now we're going to have a case of a woman who's married and a ketubah related issue. So now this is coming totally out of the blue. The other cases were actually relatively compared. This has absolutely nothing to do with anything. The only thing it has to do with is Rav Huna bar Chia said Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba about Rav, that Rav ruled like Rabbi Meir in a particular situation and paskined like Rabbi Shimon in this issue. Okay? And what it's trying to say is these are two cases where he went, I guess, kind of against the grain. And he did something atypical. Certainly Rabbi Shimon's atypical. And it seems like even Rabbi Meir's opinion is a bit out there. So, and the truth is, the reason they say that is because usually when Rabbi Meir has a disagreement with Rabbi Yehuda, the general rule is we hold like Rabbi Yehuda. So because of that, we're going to see Rabbi Meir disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and generally we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, but Rav actually judged a case. I want you to notice also the difference. One is pasak hilchata ke Rabbi Shimon. That means he just said, this is the halacha, not necessarily he had a case in front of him. But Dan is, he was in court and ruled like Rabbi Meir. So Dan Rav ki Rabbi Meir. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon we already know, but we're going to get to that at the end. That's the Rabbi Shimon of our Mishna who says if they were in the field, they were already fully grown, we assess it based on the value of what they are when they're fully grown. But what's this ki Rabbi Meir? Ditanya. I'm going to give you one explanation of this. There happen to be two different ways of reading this sugya. Okay, they explain it very differently. I mean, it still has to do with the ketubah of a woman, but I'm going to go with one interpretation, but know that there's another one. You can read up on it in the commentaries if you'd like. Okay, the background is a woman, when she comes into marriage, the husband promises her sometimes particular land in a ketubah. He could say, you can collect from this land, or he could tell her orally, when you collect your ketubah, it's going to be from this land. Or she could bring him land to the marriage that are hers already, and he has rights to the payroll, but he has to return the land at the end. Okay, and he doesn't have rights to sell that land unless she agrees. If she agrees, he could sell the land. So he wants to sell one of these properties. It's all the same. All these properties are somehow connected with her ketubah. Either it's what she's going to collect her ketubah money from this land, or it was hers from the beginning and she gets it back when the marriage dissolves, right? Whether he dies or whether he divorces her. So now he wants to sell this land. Katav l'rishon v'lo chatmalo, and she didn't sign. Now, if she doesn't sign off on it, he can't sell it because it's not his to sell. Even though he gets the proceeds of it while they're married, he doesn't have rights to sell the land itself. Lisheni, but then he goes another time and tries to sell it to somebody else, v'chatmalo, and she signed off on it. Said, yeah, you can sell it. Ibdak ktubata, divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says she lost her ketubah. She basically gave up her rights to the ketubah because she signed away on her land. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yecholai shetomar nachal ruach asiti lebali, atem malachem alai. She could say, what do you mean? I had to live with my husband. If I wouldn't have signed, he would have, first of all, God forbid, he could have beaten me, right? Or I just, I want like Shalom Bayit with my husband. He really wanted to sell this land. It was very important to him. I agreed, even though I didn't really want to agree to it, and I didn't really mean it. And really, it's mine, and I want it back. Like, what do you want from me? Like, what? And this, by the way, shows potentially, the position of some women in marriage. Again, it doesn't have to be this was all women, but that a woman, according to Rabbi Yehuda, could make this claim that I only signed it under duress, really, okay? Or just to make my husband happy, but I didn't really mean it. Like, obviously, I wouldn't mean it. Why would I give up on all my ketubah money? Isn't it obvious? And now, Rabbi Meir, his theory is, well, the first time you didn't sign, so you weren't scared of your husband then, so why are you scared of your husband now? And Rabbi Yehuda could say, look, one time it didn't happen, then he maybe got angry at her, and then the second time she said, well, I better do it because he's going to be angry with me. So it shows, again, there's many ways to think about why she didn't sign, and even if I was just doing it to make my husband happy, it could mean all sorts of things, right? It could mean the extreme of him abusing me. It could mean to the other extreme of I just want to be a good obedient wife, like not because she's scared of him or anything, but she wants to have a nice relationship, and I'll just or even like I'll conspire with you to. You can even go to that extreme. I was just conspiring with him to do that, but I didn't really mean it. Like I was just trying to help him out to sell the land, but really I didn't mean it, and it's really mine, and it's obvious it was mine, and everyone knew he had no rights to sell this. I didn't really think that my agreeing was really going to mean anything. Anyway, it's a big, wide range, and that's why, there's this disagreement. Do we take her word for it? Do we not take her word for it? Maybe she's just lying. Maybe she's just really conspiring with him, and it's not really true, and she really didn't do it just to make him feel better, and she really was agreeing to sell it. Anyway, we have this machloket, and he actually paskins like Rabbi Meir that we don't believe this woman when she said, Nachat Ruach, you signed, there's nothing we could do. And pasuk Rabbi Shimon ki hadran Rabbi Shimon aware achla perok murim shalom perok murim if say asayim satayim and pasuk like Rabbi Shimon in the case that we just said, so I'm not going to review that. Okay, next Mishna. This is a review of something we already saw. We'll just add one more point in the Gemara, which is Magidish b'toch sadeh. We didn't see this exact case, but we saw very similar cases. You make a pile you take your pile of grain and you put it in someone else's field. And then, shelo b'reshut, okay, you put your pile of grain in someone else's field without asking their permission. V'achaltam behem toshel balabayit, and the balabayit's animal eats your stuff. Well, patur, of course they're exempt because who gave you permission to put your stuff there? The im who's kabehem, and if you cause damage to someone in their field, balagadish chayav, of course you're liable for that because you put your stuff in their field and cause damage. Im higdish b'reshut, if you remember, we learned though, if an animal eats it, you could say, what was your animal doing eating it? But if they slip on it, the im higdish b'reshut, if you have permission, the bala sadeh chayav, then they're liable because they said you could bring it in, which meant, if you remember, according to Kamma anyway, meant we agree, we agree to watch it. If you remember, Rabbi said only if you explicitly agree. He didn't say that, so obviously the Gemara says, Rebbe. It sounds like our Mishnah is not following Rabbi. Now, the last time we mentioned this, we said there was a machlok at Rabbi and the rabbis. Why doesn't this mention it, right? And if you want to say that, only if he agreed to watch it. So, Amar Papa, to which they answer, no. Papa says you can explain the Mishnah even according to Rabbi, because this case is different. When I put my pile of grain, what were we talking about? When I put it in the granary and I put it in in the threshing floor. I put it on the threshing floor, and who gave me permission? Not the Bala Sadeh, even though it says Bala Sadeh in the Mishnah. It was the guard in the threshing floor. He said, leave it here. And basically his job is to watch things. So when he said, leave it here, he obviously meant he's going to watch it. Like I'm thinking once when I used to sometimes leave the schoolyard after I picked up my daughter and we take a walk, and I would leave it with the guard. And when I left it with the guard, obviously I was saying, can you watch her bag? She had a computer in her bag, and it would be like, I was a little worried about the computer, and he would watch the bag, and I knew he was watching it because that was his job, to be a shomer. In general, he watched over things. So it wasn't his job to watch people's knapsacks, but, he did, he was a guard. So it made sense. Okay. New Mishnah. With this, we'll finish with the Mishnah. We'll see Reish, Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan. This is really review, at least the first half of the Mishnah we've learned already. So if you send a fire, we're going to have to see what kind of fire is this, but you give it to a cheresh shotev katan, someone who's not responsible, and then they create a big fire from it, you're actually exempt by human law, but liable in law of heaven. Okay, if you haven't listened to Dr. Alana Steinhain's Shiur about this in our new column, now's a good time to listen while we finish up the end of the sugya. Go in depth into this case about some case where you really are responsible, but we can't convict you in a court of law. And then again, there's a wide range, and you can listen to her Shiur about the in-depth concept of what this means. Shalach biyad pikach, a pikach hayav. But if you give it to a pikach, then the pikach is liable. And yes, this was one of the 4 cases. Because then they're responsible for the fact that they caused the fire fully. Now you're not liable, right? They're fully liable. If you bring a fire and then someone else brings wood and puts the wood in the fire, which basically makes the fire spread much more, if you brought the wood, you're liable. If I brought the wood and then and you brought the flame, then you're liable. In that case, the one who brings the flame is liable, because without the flame, my wood isn't going to burn. But if someone else came, if it was just coals and then someone else came and fanned it, and that's what caused it to really go on fire, then they're chayav, hamelabeh chayav. But libta ruach kulam pturim. But if the wind came and fanned the coals and turned it into fire, then everyone's exempt. Now this is a bit strange. Wouldn't you expect a wind to come and fan it? So some people say it's a very unexpected wind. Okay, only then. If it was expected wind, then you should have assumed. Some people say no. Expected wind is important in fire in terms of spreading fire, but creating the fire, like just a coal is not much of a fire. It won't really spread. To create the fire, if it's created by wind, then that's not a fire. So there's a big debate about how to understand that last line. Okay, we're going to start with tomorrow is this big machlok at Reish, Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan that we already saw. Is why are you exempt in a court of law for giving it to a cheresh shotev katan? And what exact case are we talking about? What did you give them? An actual flame, a coal? What exactly happened here? And we'll go back and review that at the beginning of tomorrow's daf. So our big quick review, we started with this issue of the shishim, proving that it's shishim and against the Reish Galuta. From there, we got off on a tangent of all the different stages and the different opinions in this braita and what they mean. And Abaye, we have those 3 sugyos of Abaye connecting other sugyot to saying these are similar concept. Then we got to how we paskin on this issue. And then we got to the story of the Reish Galuta, and also ending with the psak is the shishim, the 60. And then we went back to the Mishna of this opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And then we said, oh, by the way, there was a case where Rav paskin, both like Rabbi Shimon and like Rabbi Meir in a ketubah case, having nothing really at all to do with our situation and with what we've been learning. And then we got to the 2 Mishnayot, one about the piles and me putting my pile in your field and causing damage. And then the issue of giving a fire or something, we'll have to see what it exactly it is, to somebody else who's responsible, what different. And this is really the beginning of the second part of our chapter, which I said at the beginning, which is all going to be about fire. And now we're moving into the topic of fire. With that, wishing everybody a good week. Shavua Tov, hoping for a quieter week.